What is history?
77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
History recounts the lives of men and women who shaped our nation and our world. George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, Harriet Tubman, Susan Anthony, Theodore Roosevelt, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, John F. Kennedy, Neil Armstrong. History is more than just some numbers, dates, and places. It's more than just a day of remembrance. History is about people. It's created by people, and oftentimes, if you look closely, it shows us their inner struggles as they often stood up for what they believed in or what they dreamed of. Or perhaps they lived a less than straight and narrow life. It's true that someone, somewhere, makes history every day. However, not every historical act is initially written down. Sometimes it takes great effort to dig through archives, letters, diaries, and photographs to determine what happened. We ignore history at our own peril. We hopefully learn from our own mistakes, but when we ignore them or forget them, it's been said that we risk repeating them. So how do we know if our history is true? We must go to the source. We become detectives of sorts, searching for the evidence from our past. Historical research thrives on the constitutional principle of a free and independent press. For when we use the tools that our Constitution guarantees us, we really don't write history, we discover it. We discover the principal players in history. We discover what happened and when a certain event took place. We learn where history was made. But perhaps the most important element in researching history is oftentimes the toughest to uncover. Why? There was a time when the mere mention of the St. Lucie and Indian rivers conjured up dreams of Amazonian jungle rivers full of excitement, adventure, and abundant game in and along its waters. Today, these rivers have become symbols of our futile attempts to re-engineer our environment for commerce and public safety, with little to no consideration for the environmental consequences of our actions. The story of the destruction of the St. Lucie River is one that is not unique to the east coast of Florida. All around the country there were examples of our attempts to re-engineer and dominate nature, to make it perform in ways that were contrary to the very existence of our environment. In so doing, we have destroyed some of the greatest treasures within the borders of our nation, and yet the destruction continues to this day.
While living in Florida, the beautiful land of flowers, we decided to buy a large sailboat and take a pleasure trip down the most beautiful river next to the Hudson in beauty and grandeur, the Indian River. We had been living in the town of Cocoa. The scenery in and around the town was magnificent. We had been living in this little town several months when we decided to take a trip down the Indian River to Jupiter Inlet. Thence up the St. Lucie River to White City, a new town just being built at the time, out in the piney woods on the banks of this river. The scenery in and around White City was the most beautiful of all the places we were ever at while in Florida. January 14th, 1894, Margaret Ann Johnson.
Margaret Ann Johnson wrote in her journal 402 years after Columbus first landed in the New World, and while he never stepped foot on Florida soil, the land of the flower came under Spanish influence shortly after his age of discovery began. For more than 300 years, most of Florida remained largely unsettled and only occasionally explored. Once under the control of the United States federal government, South Florida was still considered to be a desolate jungle territory that only the foolhardy dared explore. Even today, for those who truly wish to see the beauty of Florida's natural places, it only takes a willingness to get out of the car and step out into a bit of adventure.
And the main thing you have to see Florida, you have to get into it. You can't see it, like California, you can see it from your car. It's big giant mountains, you know. But Florida, you have to get in one with it. As we give people swamp walks, their whole attitude about Florida changes. I said, boy, this is pretty.
Clyde Butcher's work as a photographer has shown people that the real Florida isn't at South Beach or any vacation resort. The beauty of Florida is far more diverse than any man-made retreat or oasis, and the St. Lucie and Indian Rivers were once a gleaming part of the crown jewels of our state's natural diversity. In the late 1800s, South Florida was the last frontier on the east coast of the United States. Its sheer ruggedness was the likes of which most people had never experienced. So rugged was the interior of Florida that for several years, early explorers had no idea that Lake Okeechobee even existed. As deadly as it was beautiful, the biological diversity found on the St. Lucie River would soon become legendary. The earliest explorers that dared to challenge the river quickly realized its primitive nature. Even today, going into the few unspoiled areas of the river is like taking a step back into time. It's hard to imagine that anyone would want to live in such an isolated and rugged place as the Treasure Coast. Much of the original habitat that could be found on the Treasure Coast is now gone, but the Barley Barber Swamp near present-day Indiantown gives us an opportunity to turn back the clock to see the landscape as our earliest settlers did, rich in wildlife, but challenging to live in.
But in terms of the diversity, just in the wildlife and the plants alone, it's a very unique environment. And unfortunately, because of the development of Florida, if you will, and the draining of the land, these systems really don't exist much anymore. Yeah. And so this is really a last refuge of what, historical Florida around the lake looked like. And in some of the Seminole tales, they talk about the big swamp here at this side of the lake. And so it was commonly used. There's stories about some of the tribe members coming here and actually harvesting cypress to build their dugout canoes. And so it's absolutely incredible.
The St. Lucie was originally a freshwater river that had a very shallow and narrow inlet. Early American settlers started coming to the Treasure Coast in the mid-1800s, but it wasn't until the 1880s that settlers really started taking an interest in the St. Lucie River basin. One of those settlers was a gentleman named Homer Stewart. Originally from the Northeast, Homer grew up the son of a successful businessman in an upper-middle-class family. No one really knows why Homer wanted to come to Florida, but he may have wanted to make a name for himself through land speculation or pineapple farming. By 1879, the St. Lucie River and land south of the river had been surveyed by the federal government. With the completion of this survey, federal land grants could be issued, and a small but growing number of settlers began to arrive. While thousands were taking to the Oregon Trail and heading for free land in the western states and territories, there remained ample opportunities to settle lands in Florida that were nearly free for the taking. The lure of gold and silver had helped settle the Wild West, but in the late 1800s it was pineapple and citrus that brought settlers scrambling for land in Florida. Pineapple was becoming a lucrative cash crop, and Homer Stewart may have been eager to take advantage of this opportunity. Pineapple farmers in the 1880s could reap cash profits of $250 to $750 per acre. Shortly after arriving, Homer was able to talk his mother into coming down to the homestead. His letters back to his fiancée were very revealing.
My dearest Maggie, Mother has been here long enough now for the place to be in some sort of shape. Yet, we still use a trunk standing on end for a table in my room and a barrel in Mother's. She spends most of her time chasing roaches or driving our Thanksgiving rooster out of the kitchen. Today, we concluded to take a pleasure trip and ran over to Bessie's, where we ate a watermelon. It is a great undertaking to get Mother sailing, as the dock is not yet all made, and she will not let me put her aboard the same as I would a bag of flour or you. She got part of the way on the dock, and then of course began to laugh, and at last sat down on one of the stringers, unable to go or come. These heavy people are hard to manage, but once aboard the boat, are splendid ballast. Mother says she intends to live well, if the fleas, snakes, roaches, toads, lizards, spiders, sandspurs, ticks, scorpions, wasps, hornets, flies, bats, owls, and hard beds do make her get up at sunrise. Homer Stewart, November 24th, 1886.
It was little wonder that with letters like this, Homer Stewart's fiancée never did come to Florida. And while we don't really know why Homer Stewart didn't stay long in Florida, one can reasonably speculate that his love interests were firmly rooted outside of the state. While Homer may not have become a successful pineapple farmer or land speculator, there were plenty of others that were coming to the Treasure Coast and striking it big. Yet in order to cash in on the pineapple trade, transportation to the lucrative markets of the Northeast was critical. With no roads, railroads, or reliable large-scale shipping, the pineapple farmers on the Treasure Coast could only rely on small coastal sailing vessels to bring their harvest to larger shipping centers. In 1885, the idea of dredging the St. Lucie River inlet was put to the test. The inlet was opened up, but quickly closed up again since the effort was not of a large enough scale to make the dredging permanent. In 1892, another attempt to dredge the inlet was made, but it also failed when the dredging crew abandoned the project after they were invited to a party hosted by a very eligible young lady. Later that same year, a collection was taken from the early settlers, and a professional dredging company was contracted to open up the inlet once and for all. With the opening of the inlet, the St. Lucie and Indian rivers were changed into a brackish estuary. In truth, the brackish water allowed some marine species to thrive in the river that would not have otherwise been there. Any time that man begins playing with Mother Nature, there are winners and there are losers, but the effects of re-engineering the St. Lucie River were only just beginning. In the late 1800s, South and Central Florida was still a no-man's land of swamps, marshes, and upland forests that only the bravest or the foolhardy dared to enter. Yellow fever and malaria were rampant, and settlers that attempted to live in these conditions did so at their own peril. So dire were these conditions that when yellow fever broke out, as it inevitably did, settlers trying to flee to northern settlements were sometimes forced at gunpoint to return to Florida. Medical experts of the day thought that yellow fever was caused by direct contact with the carrier, and Floridians were often considered a scourge to any community. Researchers had not yet discovered that yellow fever and malaria were not contagious. It wouldn't be until the medical research team, led by Army Dr. Walter Reed, published their findings in 1901, which established the link to mosquito transmission for both yellow fever and malaria. Until then, Florida state government and some insurance companies issued travel documents that guaranteed the holder of the pass was not contagious. Water was still the lifeblood of commerce and transportation, yet even after dredging the inlet, living on the St. Lucie River was still a rugged existence. There were a number of travel guides being published that glamorized South Florida as the American Amazon. For adventure seekers, South Florida represented the last great frontier on the eastern seaboard of our country. To one John Danforth, the lure of an American Amazon was simply too great to miss. Born in New England, John Danforth had become a successful hunting and fishing guide in the North Woods of Maine. He was one of the first businessmen to market the lure of the great outdoors to the elite businessmen of the industrial age. Danforth set about creating lavish hunting and fishing lodges throughout the North Woods of Maine in the late 1800s. His marketing strategy to bring the industrial and political elite into the woods was wildly successful. For a fee, Danforth and his team of guides provided personalized hunting and fishing expeditions with all the trimmings to anyone willing to pay for it. Danforth's business thrived, but the lure of the American Amazon was so great that he simply had to explore it for himself. Once satisfied that the St. Lucie and the Indian rivers were as advertised, he set about planning a new business venture in the only way that he knew how, by going big. After arriving back in Maine, he commissioned the construction of a large hotel ship. He paid cash for the construction of the vessel, and it was designed to have a shallow draft that would be perfect for the St. Lucie River. After completion, he personally piloted the vessel down the intracoastal waterway from Maine to South Florida. No small feat in those days, but nothing would stop John Danforth. He immediately went about promoting the St. Lucie River to his clients, and with the lure of a jungle adventure, his clients came to what would soon be labeled the sailfish capital of the world. Within a year of establishing his business, his hotel boat was vandalized and sunk. A lesser man might have given up, but Danforth didn't know the meaning of the word quit. Instead, he raised the boat, cut the upper deck from its hull, hauled it ashore, and set up the first hotel in the Stewart area. With business going well, Danforth and his wife became strong promoters of the Treasure Coast. Others cashed in on the tourism business as well, and it was common for local residents to become hunting and fishing guides during the season while attending to their pineapple and citrus groves after the tourists had left. Henry Flagler finally did bring the railroad to the Treasure Coast, but after devastating freezes and unfair railroad practices all but doomed the pineapple industry, hunting and especially fishing kept the area vibrant and growing. It certainly didn't hurt that past presidents of the United States, such as Grover Cleveland and Teddy Roosevelt, were employed to promote the excitement and the adventure found on Florida's Jungle River. In 1904, Napoleon Broward successfully ran a campaign to become Florida's new governor. His campaign promise? To drain the glades and make it profitable and productive farmland. Throughout Florida, progress was being measured by one's ability to tame water, and the small town of Stewart quickly got on board the bandwagon. Yet at the same time that state and local officials were increasingly eager to drain the Everglades, a small group of women and other concerned citizens were starting to notice a slaughter that was taking place nearly in their backyard. For years, plume hunters had been descending on Florida for the sole purpose of killing birds for their feathers. The demand for these plumes from the millinery trade was so strong that at one point the feathers from select high-demand species were worth more than their weight in gold, considerably more. What made the plume hunting trade especially devastating was that the best plumes would only grow during breeding season. By killing the adults for their breeding plumes, hunters were also condemning to death the recently hatched young and the unhatched eggs. In only a few short decades, the population of Florida's wading birds had gone from approximately 2.4 million birds to less than 100,000. The resulting carnage became the beginning of a great environmental movement, and Audubon was born. At first, there were only local chapters, independent of each other but with a common purpose: to stop the slaughter. Soon, however, the National Audubon Society was chartered, and with it, stronger enforcement capabilities. Working with state and federal governments, Audubon hired game wardens to protect critical bird rookeries, but some of those early wardens paid for their duty with their lives. President Theodore Roosevelt was outraged and began establishing national wildlife refuges for birds and other endangered species. The first of these was Pelican Island National Wildlife Refuge near Vero Beach. By 1918, the International Migratory Bird Treaty Act was ratified by Congress, and the worst of the plume trade was put to an end. To this day, however, the population of Florida's wading birds has never fully recovered. 1911 saw the establishment of the Stewart Commercial Club. A newspaper that would eventually be known as the Stewart News began publishing on a weekly basis in 1913. The Stewart Commercial Club had been established to promote commerce for the area, and one of their more ambitious plans was to create a cross-state canal. It would connect Stewart with the Gulf Coast through Fort Myers. Initial plans for the canal were drawn up, and in 1915, a contract was signed for the construction of the St. Lucie Canal. The plan had the canal beginning in present-day Manatee Pocket, but the final location for the beginning of the canal and the locks was changed to the South Fork of the St. Lucie River. It would be 8 years before the waters of Lake Okeechobee would start flowing into the St. Lucie River. The initial canal was only designed to be about 4 feet deep. Upon its completion, locals thought that it was a wonderful accomplishment, but there were those that already saw the environmental consequences and the disaster that was looming. In the 1920s, the small town of Stewart was well on its way to becoming a rising star on Florida's East Coast. With the Stewart Commercial Club and local anglers promoting Stewart as the sailfish capital of the world, the community was becoming a premier destination for anglers. While adventure seekers were battling sailfish offshore, tarpon fishing in the St. Lucie and Indian Rivers was also attracting a large number of anglers. The St. Lucie Canal changed everything. The Jungle River underwent dramatic changes. The leaders of Stewart thought that they had created a means of building commerce that other communities could never enjoy. Instead, a combination of factors, including the 2 hurricanes of 1926 and 1928, spelled the beginning of the end for a river system that had been a pristine environmental sanctuary for thousands of years. All over South Florida, land developers were selling the virtues of the state. Around Lake Okeechobee, they had seen the Everglades as a vast wasteland that was screaming to be turned into productive farmland. The communities of Belglade, Pahokee, and Clewiston were formed around the southern shores of the lake, while the city of Okeechobee was established on the northern shore. Land developers realized that the lake could breach its banks. After all, for thousands of years, the water from Lake Okeechobee flowed south through the Everglades, eventually draining into Florida Bay. Foolishly, settlers believed that a levee 5 feet tall was all that would be necessary to protect them from flooding in case of a major storm. The events of 1928 would prove them dead wrong. The wind blew slowly at first, just a gentle breeze. In fact, it felt quite nice. The high humidity of the late summer was only now beginning to break, and in the early fall of 1928, a gentle breeze was indeed welcome to all. It was the only form of air conditioning that Floridians had. Windows were often left open, since a breeze coming into a house was a wonderful feeling. Despite the cooling effect, this was no ordinary breeze. It was the proverbial calm before the storm. To those that had experienced a hurricane, it was an eerie feeling, a feeling of nervous anticipation. Had they done all that they could do to prepare for a storm? Only God knew. The news was that the hurricane of 1928 had already caused severe damage to the island of Puerto Rico, but as the storm approached, the weather forecast called for the storm missing South Florida. When officials realized that the weather forecast was wrong, serious preparations for the storm were too little and too late. As the breeze grew stronger, windows were quickly shuttered. What was once a cooling breeze was quickly losing its welcome. By the time the hurricane hit West Palm Beach, the destruction was devastating and complete. Nothing was spared. Houses were turned into piles of rubble, and entire communities became unrecognizable. Along Lake Okeechobee, the winds were just as bad, but what an experienced hurricane watcher knows had come true. It wasn't the wind that killed people, it was the floodwaters. The meager 5-foot-tall dike along the south end of the lake was no match for the storm surge that blew into the communities of Pahokee, Belglade, and Clewiston. With homes blown into piles of rubble, their inhabitants were torn from their shelter and thrown into the jaws of death. Death in a hurricane does not come quickly. It was a horrible, agonizing death, as victims clung to whatever they could in the hope that they could be saved, only to realize the deadly disappointment of drowning. The lucky were killed instantly by windswept debris, but those less fortunate gasped their final breath before becoming another drowning victim, fully experiencing the anguish of their demise. Hurricanes had changed history before. The Treasure Coast was so named because the Spanish fleet didn't realize that they were sailing into the teeth of a hurricane. Early settlers knew that hurricanes could bring disaster, and with little to no warning, they often did just that. In the aftermath of the storm, thousands of corpses lay rotting in the water. A morbid construction boom of sorts ensued with the construction of hundreds of coffins. Those, however, that could not be identified, those that had no kin, those that had no money, were buried in a common grave. All too often, those common graves included a large percentage of black people. In Port Mayaca, a mass grave of 1,600 hurricane victims is still witness to the carnage of the 1928 hurricane. To this day, the hurricane of 1928 still goes down in history as one of the deadliest in our country. 13 months after the hurricane of 1928, the Great Depression hit the country with, one could argue, nearly the same force as the hurricane. The Depression devastated the country. Fortunes were lost to not only the rich and the well-to-do, but those that had no safety net, no margin of error, were devastated. The resulting bank closures and stock market collapse put the government on notice that the nation was not on the verge of a collapse. It had already happened. In Florida, the suffering from the hurricane continued, but with each new hurricane season, it was a roll of the dice to see if another big one was going to hit. Everyone knew that what was needed was a larger, taller dike. With the promise of jobs and the reclamation of swampland into productive agriculture, the feds came through. After the election of 1932, the nation's newly elected president, Franklin Roosevelt, made it a point to begin water reclamation projects that could create short-term construction jobs, as well as a promise for greater economic growth and development. The United States had already proven itself a nation of civil engineers with the completion of the Panama Canal. Where the French had failed, Yankee ingenuity had come through in a big way. What had been the most incredible civil engineering project in its day was about to give way to a host of projects that would forever change the face of our nation. Even before the Great Depression, the Hetch Hetchy Valley in Yosemite had been dammed and turned into a storage reservoir for the city of San Francisco. Now, with an economy in shambles, massive public works projects were planned around the country with one central theme in mind: control the flow of water. Controlling Mother Nature seemed not only possible, but it seemed to many that it was our nation's destiny. In Tennessee, the TVA began transforming a landscape and a river in the name of power, jobs, and improved lifestyles. On the banks of the Columbia River in eastern Washington state, the biggest of them all began to take shape. Grand Coulee may not have been the tallest dam in the world, but its overall mass and hydroelectric power potential was without equal. In the mountains of the North Cascades, the city of Seattle looked at the Skagit River as a source of nearly infinite power. Even in the rugged isolation of eastern Oregon, the Owyhee Dam project turned a desert scrub full of sagebrush and rattlesnakes into farmland available for homesteading to those tough enough to settle it. With projects like these beginning around the country, it probably wasn't a stretch to think that constructing a dike would be a cakewalk. After all, how tough could it be to build an earthen dike around Lake Okeechobee? Yet even as plans were getting underway to build the dike, there were those that still marveled at the sheer beauty of the St. Lucie and Indian rivers, but their voices were being silenced by a national push to tame Mother Nature in the name of progress and jobs. Nathaniel Pryor Reed's family moved to Jupiter Island at the same time that the dike construction was beginning. Born into a life of privilege, his parents still wanted the young Nate to understand and appreciate nature. Growing up, Nathaniel developed a love for birds, butterflies, and above all else, fishing. With his parents' blessing, the Indian and St. Lucie rivers became his personal playground.
I know this part of the Indian River Lagoon like the back of my hand because by the time I was 14, I was given as a good Christmas present a skiff with a very, very small outboard motor on it, and that was after the war. My vacations from prep school and college were spent in this part of the Indian River Lagoon and on the marvelous fishing trips on the North Fork and the South Fork of the St. Lucie.
What was the river like back in those days?
Crystal clear. There was absolutely no development. I can't remember any development. My first memories of the St. Lucie were that my mother had heard that Bert Pruitt at the Pruitt fishing camp was one of the great guides in the world. And Bert had a notorious reputation of having killed at least one person, probably 3 people, and people on Jupiter Island were absolutely horrified that I was being driven up, dropped off into Mr. Pruitt's hands for a long day of fishing. I had a boxed lunch and a canteen of water and a rain jacket, and in those days it was before spinning tackle, so I had a bait casting reel which had a star drag on it, I cast my plugs against the shoreline, and there were Mr. Pruitt. Bert was a great raconteur, and there were his pet alligators, and there were all kinds of excitements. And he had a creek that entered the North Fork where there was a constant school of 30, 40-pound tarpon.
Oh, terrific.
And we always stopped there and cast a white feather at them, and every once in a while one would take, and I would have at least 1 or 2 jumps before it threw the hook. And they were magical days, and the river was absolutely stupendous. It should have been declared a wild and scenic river if we'd had such a designation at that time.
Nathaniel Reed would go on to serve the state of Florida and the United States with distinction, eventually becoming the Assistant Secretary of the Interior under Presidents Nixon and Ford. Nathaniel Reed was right. The St. Lucie should have been declared a wild and scenic river, but in the early 1930s, making the Everglades agricultural area safe for future development was the only priority that most people were thinking of. With the original dike being only 5 feet in height, the new dike would be much taller and broader to prevent a storm surge breach. The most modern steam shovels, dredges, and earth-moving equipment came into play. With a real sense of urgency, the construction of the dike around Lake Okeechobee began in 1931. With the populations of Belglade, Pahokee, and Clewiston ravaged by the hurricane of 1928, the dike construction began along the southern shores of the lake to protect these communities. Later dike construction would provide protection for the city of Okeechobee along the northern shoreline of the lake. Flood control gates, pumping stations, and secondary canals were constructed to try to control the water level of the lake, all in an effort to save the agricultural communities that had been built up around the southern end of Lake Okeechobee and the agricultural lands that had been carved out of the Everglades. During the Depression era, getting people back to work was indeed job one. While the construction of the dike brought needed jobs to Florida, it was the agricultural jobs of the Everglades agricultural area that were of special concern. With Florida's year-round growing season, agricultural workers could depend on full-time employment if only they could get to the state. Like the workers in John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath, they came from everywhere. The Farm Security Administration, established by the federal government, gave farm workers transportation to the EAA. For a price of between $8 to $12, a farm worker could catch a ride on the back of a flatbed truck to the Everglades agricultural area to pick beans, corn, cut sugarcane, or any other crop that happened to be growing throughout the year. But the working conditions were brutal, and the housing was nearly non-existent. Extreme poverty and shanty conditions were the norm in the Everglades agricultural area. The Federal Farm Security Administration built a limited number of sanitary camps for migrant workers. They included health care and daycare for the workers' children, a camp store with provisions at reasonable prices, and most importantly, safe and secure housing that kept families out of the diseased and bug-infested squalor. But they were few and far between. The dike around Lake Okeechobee would eventually be 140 miles long. It would take much longer to construct than anyone had ever imagined. Not only was the dike completed, but the St. Lucie Canal was transformed as well. The canal was made wider and deeper to accommodate far greater water runoff into the St. Lucie River. Flood control gates at the St. Lucie locks were improved, and a hydroelectric generator was even added at the site. After 30 years of construction, the dike around Lake Okeechobee and the flood control improvements on the St. Lucie River Canal were finally completed. Former President Herbert Hoover, who had first authorized the construction project, was the guest of honor at the formal dedication in 1961. Even after the completion of the dike and the upgrading of the St. Lucie locks, additional flood control projects were designed and constructed. The Kissimmee River had long been looked at as a means of draining vast amounts of swampland for agriculture. As early as 1881, Hamilton Diston had purchased 4 million acres of swampland for $200,000. It was with the promise to the state that he could drain the land. In 1882, he began dredging activities to connect the Caloosahatchee River with Lake Okeechobee, and by 1884, Hamilton Diston had drained nearly 2 million acres of land. With dredging activities continuing, steamboat service was established from Tampa to the town of Kissimmee by means of the Caloosahatchee River through Lake Okeechobee and up the Kissimmee River. Not willing to leave good enough alone, civil engineers looked at the Kissimmee River in the 1960s as a means of further improving drainage in the central part of the state. In its natural state, the Kissimmee River was full of oxbows, or bends in the river channel. These slowed the flow of water so that impurities could be naturally filtered out by the aquatic vegetation that was part of the watershed. Engineers, on the other hand, went about straightening the river and turning it into a straight canal that sped up the drainage, but completely destroyed the water quality and the surrounding environment. With the completion of the Kissimmee River project, the vast public works projects aimed at flood control in Central and South Florida seemed to be coming to a completion. Yet while others were celebrating, there were those that were already skeptics. Ernie Lyons was born in 1905 in Laurel, Mississippi, but in 1915 his father moved the family to Florida. Ernie's father was a colorful character, and he was often involved in land speculation and any number of other money-making adventures. It wasn't long before the Lyons family moved away from Florida, at one point living as far away as Seattle, Washington. But in the early 1920s, the Lyons family moved back to Florida, and Ernie's father became an instant supporter of the newly proposed St. Lucie Canal project. Ernie wasn't so sure. As a teenager, he experienced the St. Lucie River almost as it had been before settlement. It was the jungle river that the early fishing and hunting guides had promoted to the rest of the country. It was a river so wild that the name America's Amazon still had descriptive meaning. For young Ernie, it was a freshwater wonderland of oxbows filled with fish and wildlife along its banks. Every opportunity he got, Ernie was on the river, relishing its environment and befriending its early settlers that were now approaching an age where the old tall tales almost certainly got taller with every year. In 1931, Ernie started working for a weekly paper that would eventually become the Stuart News. He had the ability to report the local news in the local vernacular that only a seasoned resident could. His writing wasn't pretty by outside standards, but it was honest, and it gave a picture of early Florida that could not be depicted in any other way. In 1945, Ernie became the editor of the Stuart News. His regular column describing the local lore of the Treasure Coast became wildly popular. Ernie wrote about the St. Lucie and Indian rivers as the treasure jewels that they were, but few were willing or able to see it.
Drifting on the surface of a Florida jungle river, like the South Fork of the St. Lucie or the northwest bank of the Loxahatchee, I experienced the feeling that nothing is ordinary, nothing is commonplace. The onyx surface of the water reflects in perfect color the images of bushy-headed cabbage palms, the moss-draped live oaks and cypress along the banks. Cascading clumps of wild asters and a fragile white spider lily are mirrored on the smooth, bland film. I drift in my rowboat on top of an image of scenery. There is probably a law which some logically minded egghead can recite to explain how a color image can be reflected on the face of a river, but please don't quote it. I'd rather marvel. What has happened to awe? Where has wonder gone? I suspect that too much has been explained by the ignorant to the stupid. Modern man's greatest loss of spirit may be that he has ceased to be amazed at the wonders all around him. Ernie Lyons, My Florida.
Ernie Lyons may not have been the only person who had a deep passion and love for the river, but his ability to transfer his love for the river onto paper made him beloved by many. Ernie would go on to become the founding president of the Florida Outdoor Writers Association. He won numerous awards as an active conservation writer. Yet no matter how much he wrote about the river, his love for the St. Lucie and all of the Treasure Coast of Florida couldn't temper the fact that the Jungle River was being tamed. Well after Ernie Lyons passed away, the St. Lucie would rear an ugly head. The Jungle River fought back against those that tried to control it with a vengeance that only Ernie Lyons would have predicted. It had taken nearly 125 years for the damage to be done, but it was total and it was complete. Early settlers had tried to change the river under the banner of public health, safety, and commerce. Even as projects were being constructed and finished in the 1960s and 70s, people were beginning to realize just how damaging they were. For the better part of the 20th century, Floridians believed that they could control Mother Nature. The St. Lucie River and its connecting bodies of water had proven them wrong. By 2016, the water in the St. Lucie River was so lethal that the Martin County government posted signs along the riverbanks. They needed to remind residents and visitors alike to not touch the water. In the summer of 2018, the water quality deteriorated even further. It forced Martin County health officials to issue public warnings that dogs were dying from drinking the water. What had once been considered a jungle river paradise, where presidents and dignitaries had come to fish, hunt, and explore, had been reduced to a brackish body of poison. The wading birds certainly had no understanding of just how bad the water was, but the fish that they were eating were dying from unnatural causes. The wonder of a jungle river that Ernie Lyons had wrote about had been reduced down to a few simple questions. Citizens living along the St. Lucie River wondered why this happened. They wondered who was to blame, and they wondered how the river was going to be fixed. The wonder of the St. Lucie River had seemingly been reduced down to a final obituary, and on its gravestone the inscription simply read, "It's not nice to fool Mother Nature." But is there really hope for the St. Lucie River? Is the river truly dead? All over Florida, the rise of angry citizens is beginning to make a difference. As far back as Ernie Lyons, there were those that warned about re-engineering our environment. And we now understand that Ernie's warnings are backed up by solid science. Dr. Edie Witter, founder and president of ORCA, Dr. Grant Gilmore, senior scientist with Estuarine Coastal and Ocean Science, and Dr. Paul Gray, research associate for Florida Audubon, are just a few of the many scientists that are beginning to shed new light on the problems facing the river. Understanding the nature and makeup of the algae blooms is critical to understanding how the environment is being harmed. In the summer of 2018, the Treasure Coast not only experienced an exceptionally strong blue-green algae bloom, but for the first time, red tide as well.
We don't just have the toxic blue-green algae blooms to deal with. We have the toxic red tide, which is a saltwater phenomenon where the blue-green algae is freshwater. And then we have a brown tide in the northern part of the Indian River Lagoon. It's not toxic, but it's so dense that it's blocked out the sunlight and killed the seagrass and led to oxygen deprivation that has caused a mass mortality of fish. So it's all because we're overloading the ecosystem with nutrients, both nitrogen and phosphorus.
The algae blooms of 2013, 16, and 18 were not the first to be recorded on the St. Lucie River, but these blooms did make national news. It's now feared that what had been considered an exception may now become the norm thanks to rising water temperatures and increased pressure on Florida's water supply by an ever-increasing population. Massive algae blooms seem to originate in Lake Okeechobee, but a large percentage of the nutrients that feed these algae blooms actually come from polluted water north of the lake. The pollutants range from cattle waste, agricultural and residential fertilizer, and leaking septic tanks from residential developments. Algae blooms fed by these pollutants make the river, for all practical purposes, an instrument of environmental mass destruction. But why does water have to be discharged into the St. Lucie River in the first place?
We have to let the watershed hold water again. When we built this drainage system, it's a very efficient drainage system, and one of the Corps of Engineers colonels that signed the document in 1949 said Florida's got to remember they got two problems. One's flooding, and we built you a really good drainage system to help with your floods. The other's droughts. And if you overdrain the area, you're going to make your droughts worse. And that's exactly what we've done. And so when it rains now, a drop of water doesn't sit here for 6 months. It goes right to the lake, just immediately. And then we dump it, and it's gone. And so during the hurricanes of 2004 and 5, we dumped enough water to meet all the needs of the farmers for 6 years around the lake. And it's not that we didn't have enough water, we wasted it. And so what we need to do is reduce this drainage, and so when it's wet, we're going to catch as much water up here as we can so it doesn't get into the lake and start that bad series of events. And then when the drought starts, we've got water left over. We've got something to work with. And so we're really trying to rebuild the system to what it was originally, but we didn't appreciate the benefits that were there. And, drainage has helped us develop Florida and make Florida what it is today. There's good things there, but we overdid it. And we've got to turn it back and start catching water and using it beneficially rather than the process we're in now.
Scientists studying the river for decades have come up with a number of solutions. They know how to fix the problem, but is there sufficient political will to make the necessary changes? They're being faced with relentless pressure from the sugar industry and other powerful lobbying groups.
We could stop the releases, and if we could control the homeowners from Orlando south and what they do, and to understand that they're in Florida and they're directly connected to that water. You're directly connected. From my mailbox 6 miles west of the lagoon, it's 4 hours when the floodgates are open for the water at my mailbox to reach the lagoon. And I've had people that live out there say, well, I'm not connected to the lagoon. I said, yes, you are. In fact, the blue crab migrate by the mailbox, So, and then the lockmaster up there at Lake Okeechobee lets these striped mullet go from the St. Lucie River go into the lake. He locks them through when they build up, and he locks them back and forth. So we're all connected.
So widespread is the damage that in our current era of environmental awareness and concern, it's hard to believe that an environmental crisis of this magnitude is actually happening in the first place. It was all preventable, but the Army Corps of Engineers has been in a losing battle, balancing flood control against environmental science. Lake Okeechobee's natural floodplain that allowed water to feed the Everglades is now the Everglades agricultural region. Because of the development of the Everglades agricultural region, water that nature intended to have moving south is now being transferred over to either the Caloosahatchee River on the west coast or the St. Lucie River on the east coast. Since the creation of the Herbert Hoover Dike, the Army Corps of Engineers has not been allowed to let Lake Okeechobee's water flow south as it had for thousands of years. The water is too polluted, and the Everglades agricultural area blocks the water's natural flow from Lake Okeechobee through the Everglades and into Florida Bay. 125 years of water projects have prevented this from happening. A comprehensive Everglades restoration plan was created in 1999, yet little has been accomplished to restore the flow of water from Lake Okeechobee into the Everglades. Instead, these nutrient-rich waters from urban and agricultural sewage runoff have been feeding the algae blooms in Lake Okeechobee before being discharged into the Caloosahatchee and St. Lucie rivers. These discharges have happened on a yearly basis, but the discharges of 2016 and 18 touched a raw nerve that had never been exposed before. As businesses were forced to close, as tourists canceled their vacation plans, and as local residents stayed away from the water due to its pure toxicity, all hell broke loose.
The disaster that's happening in our estuary right now is more severe than the BP oil spill that happened out in the Gulf. Sort of thing. Here's what you need to know. This is 911. Stop the discharges right now. Right now. No.
Local residents took to the streets, demanding emergency county council meetings. They expected action to do whatever it took to stop the flow of water from Lake Okeechobee into the St. Lucie River. In the summer of 2016, the Martin County Council tried putting pressure on the state and federal governments. State and local politicians made visits to the river, while citizens continued protesting water releases that put more than 1 billion gallons of algae-laced water into the St. Lucie River every day. Massive fish kills, the near elimination of oyster beds, and the reduction in seagrass beds were the result. Citizens, through local environmental groups, organized demonstrations to help bring more focus on the subject. One of the biggest in 2016 was the Buy the Land rally at Stewart Beach. Thousands of citizens came to join the rally, demanding that the state purchase land that could be used to store water and prevent water releases into the St. Lucie River. All of these efforts began to produce results in the form of public opinion and political pressure. The state of Florida, through State Senator Joe Negron, proposed purchasing up to 60,000 acres of land around the Everglades agricultural area to serve as water storage for excess water that would otherwise have to flow through the St. Lucie Canal. 2 years of legislative wrangling produced a proposed water storage area that was cut in half. The large sugar conglomerates were strong opponents to this plan, citing jobs and the economy as major reasons why they were against it. They vowed not to allow the purchase of a single acre of farmland for water storage. History, however, was not on their side. The entire Everglades agricultural area was once part of the Everglades. To the people along the St. Lucie River, it was time to let the water flow south again, as it had for thousands of years. It seems that no one can predict when or even if this endless cycle of environmental madness will end. With additional years or possibly decades of being used as an environmental waste dump, the people of the Treasure Coast of Florida continue to be justifiably angry. Florida's population continues to grow, and developments continue to encroach into rural acreage. As we experience these growing pains, we must ask ourselves, do we have an environment that is worth saving? Will Florida become known as a land of condos and beaches, golf courses and homeowner associations? Or is there something else that should define our state?
There's a lot of education to be done, and it's getting awfully close to being too late. I mean, it's just, Florida is such a fragile state. People don't realize how fragile it is because we have a lot of water, but it's surface water. And the whole ground is rocky, it's like a rock sponge. People don't understand how Florida works, and politicians, I guess, just don't think it's that important.
Clyde Butcher's photography has helped Floridians understand and truly appreciate what Florida's natural areas are like. But what are we giving the next generation of Floridians? To one group of kids, they're not standing still and accepting the results of 125 years of environmental mismanagement.
The River Kids came into being in 2011 in the town of Souls Point when I happened to be the mayor of Souls Point. Two girls, 10 years old, decided to raise money for those old guys in the Rivers Coalition who needed some help. And so they put together a lemonade stand on the side of the road and raised $35 or so and gave it to the Rivers Coalition. And those old guys were so taken by that the River Kids were born. And the kids named themselves the River Kids. They came up with their own mission statement. Our mission is to speak out, get involved, and raise awareness because we believe that kids should have a voice in the future of our rivers. They started advocating in front of Martin County Commission, City of Stewart, ended up going to Tallahassee, Washington. Of course, they needed their parents' help to be able to transport themselves up there, and they have really changed the game by reaching people's hearts about the effects of all of this on future generations.
Florida is at a crossroads. Do we want to preserve our natural heritage that includes elements like the St. Lucie River, the Indian River Lagoon, Lake Okeechobee, and the Everglades? Their beauty can't be replicated, can't be replaced, and can't be engineered. Water has always been the lifeblood of Florida, but have we learned our lesson from history? Will we learn to live within the limitations of our natural environment, or will we continue our age-old habit of resource stripping, depletion, and manipulation? Hope springs eternal for Florida, but only time will tell if the St. Lucie River will once again be known as a jungle river, America's Amazon.
I find peace in the upper rivers. Their charm is that you can still be alone on them, look up at the stars or the clouds and think. They unlock the mind and its friend, the spirit. These waters remind me of the Psalms and their beauty of what the hand of God has done. Why, I wonder, do we spend billions of dollars to get these cold, bleak, barren, inhospitable landscapes of the moon, but cannot afford to save our children's children, a veritable Eden close at hand? Inevitably, these magic quiet places will be gone, the beauty of the jungle destroyed by what we call progress. Houses, beer cans, water skiers, and TV antennas. They will be used, as every other place of beauty is, for waterfront homes, country clubs, yacht basins, and marinas. But when human beings roost on them, their true charm will vanish. No finer use could be found for the upper rivers than to have them leave them as they are. We build churches of wood and stone, but fail to preserve the living cathedrals of nature, which can never be rebuilt by human hands. Ernie Lyons, My Florida.